Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as I mentioned at the end of last week, going to be doing a lot of content that connects to my trip to the UK the last couple of weeks. This one isn't directly connected, but it's still inspired by. I got to spend a couple of days in York. My family and I absolutely loved our time in York. It's one of the places we definitely want to go back to because there's a lot more to explore there. And while we were there, I made a quick video some of you may have seen. If not, I'll throw it at the end. You'll be able to see the link to it. From the statue of the Emperor Constantine, which is out front of York Minster. Constantine was proclaimed emperor upon his father's death in York. So there's a connection there in northern England to the Emperor Constantine. So we're going to look at one of the most iconic moments in Roman history. The moment when Constantine really becomes the Constantine that we know and remember from history, and it has to do with why he took the empire in the direction of Christianity. It's the Battle of Milvian Bridge. So I acknowledge up front, don't know a ton about Roman history. It's not an area that I am well versed in, but I know a little bit. So I'll try to add some context to where I can, but I'm here to learn with everyone else. So if you are someone who knows a lot about Roman history, please add to the discussion in the comment section below. If there's something you learned in this you didn't know before, let us know that as well. I'm excited to learn together. Let's dive in.
October 27th, 312 CE. This is how the scribe says it happened. Constantine, who claims to be the emperor of the West, faces battle tomorrow. His sleep is fitful, for his enemy has more men, and more importantly, has Rome.
So it's interesting you hear him say Constantine claims to be the emperor of the West. So my understanding, this is a time in history, beginning of the 4th century, where there are actually 4 emperors in Rome, in the Roman Empire. You've got 2 in the West, 2 in the East. And they have the titles of Augustus and Caesar. Augustus is kind of the senior emperor in both the West and the East, so there's one of each. And then there's kind of a junior emperor, or Caesar. And typically how it's been working at this time is that when the Augustus dies, whoever is the Caesar moves up to become the senior emperor. Well, Constantine has skipped that. His father was Augustus in the West, had only been Augustus for about a year when he dies, I think in 306 in York. And his father, as he's dying, urges his army to proclaim his son Constantine as Augustus, which is not how things are supposed to be done, and they do that. And so now you've got a war on your hands, a civil war, where Constantine is going to be fighting the other emperors. And so that's what this is. Maxentius is the guy, I believe, who should have been promoted to Augustus, but gets skipped over. So now there's fighting.
But suddenly, a symbol comes to him. The Chi Rho. A combination of 2 Greek letters. And then a
2 Greek letters, which are the first 2 letters of, I think, Christos, which would be the Greek for Christ, Jesus. And so it's basically a sign from the Christian God to a pagan emperor Constantine.
voice, speaking with the force of God, commands him to mark this heavenly sign on the shields of his men. The next morning,
and he's told, I think he's told, by this sign you will conquer. And then Maxentius is going to get his own kind of sign of what's to come. And so you have these kind of, things are very heavily, just like they are for much of history, very heavily influenced by religion, by oracles, by signs, by all of these sorts of supernatural things. People were always looking for the supernatural to know that they had the support of God or of the gods.
Inside the walls of Rome, another emperor seeks divine guidance. Emperor Maxentius, Constantine's enemy, visits the Temple of Apollo to consult the Sibylline books of prophecy. There, he learns that an ancient oracle had predicted that, on this day, the enemy of Rome would perish. So,
And like a lot of the kind of oracles and signs and like predictions that we get from this time in history, they get interpreted one way by the person who hears them, but in hindsight, knowing the history, we look back and say, oh, that actually meant something very different.
He orders his army to march. 2 men, guided by different divine prophecies, will soon meet in battle at the Milvian Bridge. Before we continue, I've got something I'm really excited about.
Skeletor? Is that Skeletor hanging on the wall? I grew up in the 80s, and so I had all the He-Man figures growing up, and so it's kind of cool to see Skeletor there. I didn't mention it earlier, but the link is in the description to the original content from Extra History, as you know, one of my favorite channels to react to.
Longtime viewers might know that Extra History got its start way back in 2013, when the folks at Creative Assembly sponsored a series of videos on the Punic Wars to both promote their upcoming release of Total War Rome 2 and to get more folks excited about Roman history. Well, fast forward to around 7.5 years later, and we got a similar email asking if we'd like to do it again. This time, with an episode celebrating the release of Total War Rome Remastered. And of course, we were thrilled. I mean, our series started with this team up, and now here they are, revisiting their game that defined the series. I mean, if that's not symbolism feeling just right, I don't know what is. And because we recently did a series on the 3rd century crisis that stopped just before Constantine, we knew exactly the topic we wanted to cover. So here we are, back where we started, thanking Creative Assembly for their support, their belief that historical content is important, and for inspiring our journey with Extra History. Aw, I'm not crying, you're crying. Okay, back to it. The great Emperor Diocletian is dead, having lived long enough to see his reorganization of the empire falling apart. Before his death, Diocletian had broken the unwieldy empire down to 2 administrative halves, the East and the West, each governed by a senior and junior emperor, the 4 officials theoretically working in concert as a tetrarchy, or rule of 4.
Theoretically working in concert. How many times have we seen in Roman history when you have multiple people at the top that it ends up in civil war? You know, you've got all of these times that this happened because inevitably human nature comes into it, and people are not going to operate within the confines and the rules that have been placed in front of them, and they're going to want that power for themselves. And that's why Constantine is going to become Constantine the Great, is because he's going to take this rule of 4, this tetrarchy, and he's going to blow it up, and he's going to reunite everything back under one guy.
But when Diocletian retired, the intricate system of succession broke down. By 306 CE, there were 6 people claiming imperial positions, most fighting each other. Generals and sons of former emperors vied for control, and the rising number of Christians in the empire were deeply dissatisfied, having endured under Diocletian the worst persecutions they'd suffered to date. And in the West, it was clear that 2 candidates were headed for a collision course: Constantine and Maxentius. Constantine rules from Britain, having claimed the title of junior emperor when his father died, but only with the backing of the army. Meanwhile,
So it's interesting they say he claimed the title of junior emperor because my understanding was that they actually proclaimed him Augustus. But I want to look this up because I want to make sure that we're right. Okay, so here's what it says right here. Although 2 legitimate sons of emperors were available, Constantine and Maxentius, the son of Maximian, both of them were overlooked in this transition of power. Instead, Flavius Valerius Severus and Maximus Daia were made Caesars. Constantine subsequently left Nicomedia to join his father in Roman Gaul. However, Constantius, who was Constantine's father, fell sick during an expedition against the Picts of Caledonia, which is Scotland, and died July 25th, 306 in Eboracum, which is York today. Let's see, they immediately proclaimed Constantine and Augustus, which is senior emperor. Under the tetrarchy, Constantine's succession was of dubious legitimacy. While Constantius, as senior emperor, could create a new Caesar, which would be a junior emperor, Constantine's, or rather his troops' claim to the title of Augustus ignored the system of succession that had been established in 305, just the year before. Accordingly, Constantine asked Galerius, the Eastern Augustus, to be recognized as heir to his father's throne. Galerius granted him the title of Caesar. Okay, so, and promoted Severus to Augustus of the West. So while his troops did proclaim him Augustus, Constantine accepts the role of Caesar, which is junior emperor. So that's where I was confused. They're right.
Maxentius, from a noble Roman family, was furious that the Senate accepted Constantine's claim. After all, before becoming senior emperor, Constantine's father had been a rough soldier and his mother was a barmaid. How dare they? Not to be outranked, he convinced the army in Rome, dissatisfied with the city's leadership, to declare him emperor. But to keep that power, Maxentius had to make the population of Rome think he was better than his predecessors. So he decided the best course was to remake the city, which had declined in importance and was no longer the empire's center of power. Maxentius initiated a huge number of public works to bring back the city's glory. And for 6 years, he succeeded. He raised buildings stamped with his name, changing the cityscape, and erecting a huge basilica above the Forum. And predictably, with his interest in architecture, his military strategy relied on the walls of Rome. In fact, in those 6 years, he weathered 2 sieges from other imperial claimants. But raising monuments means raising taxes. And the more money Maxentius extracted, and the more sieges they suffered, the unhappier his subjects became. Which was just fine with Constantine.
So the whole time Constantine's just chilling out in Britannia, way, really far away from the climate of things in Rome, just kind of waiting for his opportunity.
Who bided his time in Britain, as Maxentius diminished his forces fighting other would-be emperors. Plus, Constantine's spies said Maxentius was getting less popular by the day, meaning if Constantine just kept waiting, Rome might fall to revolt. But Constantine also understood the symbolism of active conquest. So against his advisors' counsel, he crossed the Alps with 40,000 men and invaded northern Italy, scoring a series of quick victories, despite the fact that Maxentius had 100,000 troops at his call. And since Constantine treated the conquered cities well, soon he was welcomed into every town he came to, hailed as the true emperor. Meanwhile, Maxentius demolished the center of all of the bridges across the Tiber River, hoping to trap Constantine on the other side. The first salvo in a grinding siege. But then came the night of dreams and prophecy, where Constantine heard the voice of the Christian God. Or rather, a god. See, Constantine adhered to the proto-monotheism of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and his dreams of light and divine voices muddled the difference between the Christian God and Sol Invictus.
It's fair to assume that by this point, this is 300 years into Christianity, 250, something like that. Constantine would have been very familiar with Christianity. Regardless of how he felt about it, you could not be in his position and not have a fairly good understanding of who the Christians were, what they believed, because of the just sheer number of them and the fact that pretty much every Roman emperor for the last 250 years has been dealing with the Christians, many of them dealing with them in a very heavy-handed way. So he certainly would have been familiar with them, with their theology, with who they believed Jesus to be, things like that.
Symbol revealed to him, which he painted on his men's shields and later incorporated into his banner, combined the first 2 Greek letters of Christ's name. Yet it was also a general notation for good. And this all makes sense. Constantine's father had mostly opted out of Diocletian's persecutions, and his army had Christian troops. Plus, Constantine's vision and his use of this divinely granted symbol was ambiguous enough that his mixed pagan Christian troops could all get behind it.
That's actually really fascinating, because you think about this. If you're a Christian soldier in Constantine's army and you know that your fellow Christians have been persecuted heavily in the Roman Empire for a long time, and now suddenly you see this as an endorsement of your faith, you're going to fight hard for this guy. And likewise, the other guys around them, because, like he said, it's kind of ambiguous enough. Anytime you can give them a symbol to fight for, you can give them something that seems greater than them, that might make a difference, rather than just fighting for glory, fighting for the emperor, fighting for money. Motivation is key here.
A message of certain victory, whatever you believed. Maxentius, by contrast, had his own prophecy, that the enemy of Rome will perish. Goaded by this, and perhaps thinking Rome's populace would overthrow him if it came to a siege, Maxentius sallied out to meet Constantine on the open field. Both armies had been reduced in the war, with Maxentius's 25,000 men still outnumbering Constantine's 20,000.
Pretty even, though.
But because he'd cut all the bridges across the Tiber, Maxentius made his engineers build a new pontoon bridge near the 2 halves of the stone Milvian bridge, its center arch broken. Then they crossed to meet Constantine in battle. October 28th, 312 CE. Maxentius outnumbers Constantine. He has Rome to fall back on, and his troops are fresh. But Constantine's troops are better trained, and Constantine is a cunning commander.
And listen, 25,000 against 20,000, they're outnumbered, but honestly, when we see some of the battles that have been won by armies far outnumbered, greater than that. The bottom line is that is a pretty negligible difference in manpower.
He sees immediately that Maxentius has made a mistake. He's drawn up his line too close to the river. It begins with a cavalry engagement, 2 blocks of horsemen meeting, spears dart and thrust, clubs swing, and eventually Maxentius's cavalry breaks. Constantine's line advances, throwing javelins and rushing into combat. Shields bash and grind, swords thrusting around their edges. Maxentius's troops are forced back step by step. Constantine's cavalry harry their flanks. Normally, they would use the ground behind them to fall back and tighten their formation, straighten their line. But this close to the river, there's simply no staging ground to do so. When their line finally breaks under the assault.
Man, the one thing you don't want to do is have yourself backed into a corner and not give yourself options. You always want to leave yourself as many options as possible. And so to maneuver your troops into a situation where you don't have a good way to maneuver behind you, you don't have a good avenue of escape, it's poor planning on Maxentius's part.
There's nowhere to run, just the cold waters of the Tiber and a narrow, unsteady pontoon bridge. Maxentius calls a retreat, hoping to pull back to Rome. But he's in a mass of fleeing men. The Praetorian Guard are standing firm, trying to hold back Constantine so Maxentius can escape across the bridge. But then Constantine's horsemen drive into the Praetorians with a crunch, and they shatter as well. Maxentius hears wood under his horse's hooves. Oh, all right, he's on the bridge. But so is everybody else. Oh no. There's a sound of tortured wood splintering as metal joints tear free from the timber. The bridge cracks in the center, tipping like a capsized ship. And Maxentius, who started with 100,000 soldiers, the walls of Rome, and the prophecies of the gods themselves on his side, hits the water and sinks. Constantine enters Rome the next day, greeted as a hero. A great man, favored by divine powers, who has come to liberate Rome from its enemy, Maxentius, just as the Sibylline books prophesized. They parade Maxentius's head around the city. And Constantine will not even allow his enemy's memory to survive. He orders Maxentius's name struck off everything he built, including the great basilica above the Forum. Yet, unlike previous imperial conquerors, in his victory, Constantine omits one thing. Though his procession stops at the Temple of Jupiter, he does not offer sacrifice there. It's a political dance Constantine will increasingly play, playing it fast and loose, and keeping it ambiguous whether he is at heart a worshipper of Sol Invictus or the Christian god. The next year, he will issue the Edict of Milan, granting tolerance to Christians in the empire. His propaganda about the Milvian Bridge will center around divine aid, but the triumphal arch he erects will not show the Chi-Rho.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, and this is debated heavily to this day. Was Constantine really a Christian? But you could say that about so many leaders throughout history who go from being pagan to being Christian. How much of that is political? How much of their conversion is about winning the populace? How much of it is about scoring points? How much of it is genuine faith? We'll really never really know for sure. But what we do know is that this is a turning point in Roman history where Rome is going to allow Christianity to flourish within the empire, and Rome is going to become the avenue through which Christianity is going to now be spread throughout Europe.
Or any Christian symbols, only that he was inspired by the divine. The more overtly Christian messages would come later, and orally, so they could be changed as needed. For the young emperor who had witnessed Diocletian's great persecution as a boy would not only legalize Christianity, but increasingly favor it. And in doing so, the story of his vision would shift. 16 years after the battle, a scholar wrote that as they marched to fight Maxentius, Constantine's army saw the Chi-Rho written in the sky, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer." And Constantine's coins would carry the Chi-Rho, as would his banner. The sign under which, whether inspired by God or simply lured by power, he did indeed conquer at the broken back of the Milvian Bridge.
And there's a good point to be made there in that too, which is that a lot of stories that seem to be like really just blown out of proportion probably at their core have some truth to them. So this probably does start with Constantine having a dream or a vision of some kind. but then it gets embellished over the years to being the whole army saw the sign and things like that. And this is true even in family history. You know, you might have grown up hearing some story that some relative did something, and it may have over the years gotten embellished and become more than it really was. But at its heart, there's probably some truth to it. A perfect example in my family, when I first met my wife and we started dating, her dad told me that he had an uncle back during the Civil War who was a bodyguard for Abraham Lincoln. And I initially thought, okay, come on, there's no way that's true. And if he was, he didn't do a very good job. But as I did research, I found out that in 1862, Governor Todd of Ohio, who was from where I lived, the Youngstown area, had visited Abraham Lincoln and was disturbed to see that Lincoln had no protection. You know, there's no Secret Service at this point, things like that. And so he asks permission to raise a company of soldiers from Ohio to serve as protection for the president. And they were called the Ohio Light Guard. And they raised a company with one man from each of Ohio's counties. And the man from Mahoning County, Ohio, which is where I live now, was a guy named Emery Swank, who was indeed the brother of my wife's great-great-great-grandmother. So he did, in fact, have an uncle who was a bodyguard for President Lincoln. It just wasn't exactly the way that he thought it was. So that's true with a lot of these stories and histories. At their heart, there is some truth to them. They just may have gotten muddled over the years. So let me know your thoughts. Did you learn something maybe you didn't know? I definitely learned some things there. Add to the conversation. Let's learn together. Use the comment section below. Check out the link to my video from the statue of Constantine in front of York Minster. I'll put that up here on the screen so you can check that out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.